Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Julia Hughes, and I'm the head of USA East here at Aurora. Today's discussion feels like a particularly timely one. I think Zach, who's joining us as a guest, will agree with me that we probably have gone no 2 days recently without having a discussion about data center demand in the United States and really the impact that that's going to have on power systems. As I've said, we've been having that conversation in the US probably for a little while now, and that will become clear throughout today's episode on why that is, but it's really becoming a bigger topic globally as well. So I think today's topic will be an interesting one for audiences all over. I'm joined today by a guest who has really become a good friend of Aurora's at this point. We're welcoming Buddy Rizer, who is the Executive Director for the Department of Economic Development in Loudoun County, Virginia. Buddy is largely credited as the architect of Data Center Alley, so that's the world's largest concentration of data centers and data center load. He leads the agency responsible for encouraging growth and developing relationships with Loudoun's business community, and has done some pretty incredible things during his tenure, including the fact that he and his team have attracted more than $60 billion in new commercial investment and more than 50,000 new jobs in the area. Really excited to have you here. Welcome, Buddy.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
And we're also joined today by Zachary Edelen, who leads Aurora's coverage of PJM, which is the world's largest competitive power market, and of course, the home to Virginia. Welcome, Zach.
Thanks, Julia. Great to be here, and great to be here with you too, Buddy.
Excellent. Well, so let's dive right in with the interesting stuff. I mentioned Buddy here. You're the architect, so to speak, of Data Center Alley. Can you give us a little bit of context on that? Why is Northern Virginia really the global hotspot for data center demand? Walk us through that from inception to how we got to where we are now.
Well, I think you have to go way back to the late 90s when AOL established their headquarters here in Loudoun County. We had already had a lot of technology going on in the Northern Virginia area as the ARPA decided to, connect the internet through the portals throughout the Northern Virginia. But as AOL came here, they've decided to move the internet exchange to Loudoun County as well. So we ended up with a lot of fiber in the ground. We had a lot of great location advantages near Washington Dulles Airport. We had a lot of available land and power. And really at that point, you wanted to be as close to AOL as possible because back in those days, the internet was AOL and AOL was the internet for many people. So pre-TechCom bubble burst, we had a lot of companies that were established here, UUNet and PSINet and MCI WorldCom. And so we had a lot going on here. And then the tech bubble burst and we had, like everyone else, kind of slow down. When I arrived here in 2006, we started thinking, now what can we do to revive our economy? Because we were overly dependent on residential real estate. We were 81% dependent on residential real estate in 2007. Of course, we know that in 2007, 2008, we had the Great Recession. We lost a great deal of home value. So we lost about a third of our tax revenue. So we were desperate. Thought, let's try to get some data centers going here and proactively went after them and tried to grow on our strategic advantages. And I think built a pretty powerful story around that.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. And Buddy, we'll have to see if our global listeners had that same experience. But certainly here in the United States, I think everyone had that at AOL.com email address before the rest of us switched over to other providers. What did that look like from your perspective? I mean, like you said, you had to really get creative. So I'm curious on what some creative mechanisms looked like that you passed on to data centers to make the spot look appealing.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was we were really one of the first groups that proactively went after data centers. I mean, we tried to tell the story. We obviously had the internet hub here, which, was really important and a great strategic advantage. Early on, we started working with power companies and Dominion Power in particular, and started building that story that we could get you power within 18 months, that we wanted to make sure. We worked with the state to establish one of the first sales tax incentives. But I think most importantly, we created time to market and predictability to get things permitted here faster than really anywhere else. And time to market matters. So we just really went out there and tried to make sure that this was the easiest and best place to work, and really got a lot of momentum. And as we already had DuPont Fabros here. So once we got Digital Realty here, Equinix was here, Verizon was here, then we started to see that clustering effect. And the more success you get, the more success you start to see come. So we really got to a point where we were managing our success a lot more than we were trying to attract it, and that was a good place for us to be.
Yeah, incredible. And I suspect there were probably a lot of positive benefits back to the residents of Loudoun County from those initiatives.
Well, it completely changed our community. We had gotten to the point in 2007, 2008 where, our tax rate went up to $1.285. We were laying off employees. We were cutting back on services. Our employees didn't get raises for years. But through the data centers and through the amount of money that we get from taxes through data centers, we have been able to lower our tax rate by 42 cents. So we went from one of the highest tax rates at $1.285 to now one of the lowest tax rates at $86.5. And through that, we put $1 billion into local roads, $1 billion into schools, if not more. We've been able to do all kinds of things, like put a penny of our tax rate into affordable housing. There's just so many things that the data center industry has been able to kind of open up for us and enable us to do. We're going to get about $1 billion in local tax revenue from data centers this year.
Buddy, you've definitely described there really the ecosystem, I think, that data centers both create and then also require. And a couple of very interesting points that I'll note that I want to make sure that we get back to in just a second about what it takes to really get a data center in the ground, so to speak, and then up and running and connected. So let's definitely pick on that in just a second. Zach, first, though, I want to ask you if you can help us contextualize that incredible data center concentration that Buddy has just described. I mean, how much load really is that versus what we're seeing in other regions, other parts of the world? And then maybe in the context of overall demand in Virginia, what percentage of that load is that describing?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, Julie. And I think the top level story is that it's been an incredible success. So to compare across a few of these dimensions, so just that sort of Northern Virginia area, and that's almost all Loudoun County that has these data centers. What we found is it has not only the highest concentration of data centers in the US, but actually globally, to the point where no other single country has as much data center capacity as Northern Virginia does outside of the US and China. It's just a humongous concentration that's gone on there. That equates currently to about 4.5 gigawatts of load. And I don't want to get too much into the numbers. But what this means really is that this year, about a quarter of Virginia, the entire state of Virginia's electricity usage is going to come from these data centers. So it's just a vast amount. And that's just, I'm jumping the gun a bit, but it's just predicted to go up and up as well.
And it, I think, paints a really good example and story of why folks are starting to look at, or have always looked at, Virginia for what the future might look like, right? Virginia has already blazed the trail, and now we're having more conversations in other parts of the United States and other parts of the U.S. So I'm sure, Buddy, you've already gotten a handful of phone calls of how to get systems set up elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I spend almost as much time talking to communities around the world now as I do working here these days. Because it is, I mean, one of the things that I always joke, one of the things that we do in government is we always try to look to what somebody else has done. How did somebody else do it? How did somebody else handle it? We have the opportunity that no one's really done what we've done. But we are very happy to share that. And listen, we've made some mistakes along the way. But we've also done some very good things along the way. And I think that, we've done some very smart steps that probably are best practices.
Yeah, so let's maybe pick up there and go back to that topic that we had teased a little bit earlier, which is what you have done to get those data centers connected. I mean, what does it really look like from conception, so to speak? You said you've gotten it to about 18 months to get interconnected to the system. And of course, we're an energy podcast, so that's the topic we care a lot about. And it sounds like you have a really strong working relationship with Dominion in the region to get that going.
Yeah, and really that was job one, right? I mean, we knew we had the internet connection. That was probably the most important thing. At that point, that was the top of the list. Internet connection was at the top of the list. Today, I would argue power's at the top of the list, but back then it was internet, and then then it was power. So we started working really early on with Dominion because I wanted to understand, what were the barriers to get this, and what were the timelines, and how did it work? How did the hookups work, and what did companies need to do, and what was the government's role? All that was really, really important to understand. And we had a very willing partner in Dominion. They were very proactive, and early on, I mean, they actually set up a practice to work with data centers, and it's one of the first, if not the first, to do that. But what we really learned early on was to define our opportunity. If you look at a map of where data centers are developed in Loudoun County, you'll see that they are by and large along electric corridors, high voltage corridors. The north-south that goes up and down Loudoun County Parkway, the east-west that goes, Route 50 and up and down Washington Old Dominion Trail. Now the Leesburg cluster. These are very significant energy corridors already. So that's kind of where we wanted to make sure that we were targeting for data centers. By doing that and marketing that land that was already proximate to power, it gave us a much easier path to get this done, much more predictable and less intrusive to the communities around it. As we've continued to grow, that's become a lot more challenging. So it's been a lot harder for us, especially from really 2022 on to get the amount of power into the market that we need. And it has involved new high voltage lines coming in and a new ring that I'm sure we'll talk about. But early on, I think it was important that we wanted to make sure that we were siting in locations that was going to make it easy to get the power to market.
You touched on something there, Buddy, which is 2022. So for those of us that follow PJM Power, maybe we're a very niche sector of the population, but alas, there's 3 of us on this call. So 2022, I think we really started to see some of those impacts on the power system, very locally, but also Dominion broadly. Maybe, Zach, that's a good point to pull you in again. Talk us through what happened in congestion in 2022 in Northern Virginia. How do we see localized price spikes? And then maybe talk us through what Buddy just teed up in terms of the additional transmission upgrades required around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically, you can kind of track what's been going on in Loudoun County in power, and basically the extent to which these data centers have been taxing the power grid. If you look at the actual power prices at the nodes. And so for a little bit of an aside, it's sort of a node, for those who might not know this, a node is essentially a point often represented by a physical point in the system where there's actually a price attached to it. And so these data centers will often locate right next to and attached to sort of a node on the transmission grid. The US has a nodal pricing system, unlike, say, Europe. And so that means essentially you get at least in PJM, these big off-takers pay a very localized price. And so what we've seen happen is usually that price that they paid for electricity has been pretty much on par with the rest of the state or the rest of Dominion. Dominion essentially serves most of the Eastern Virginia. And Dominion's been, as Buddy said, pretty good at actually getting data centers the power they need. But 2022, we really started to see the system start to struggle. 2022 is already a bit of a strange year in terms of power. There's obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which basically sent natural gas prices soaring globally. So already we're seeing some pretty big spikes, and I think that exacerbated a bit of what's going on. But especially right around Loudoun County, we started to see power prices really even double in some months compared to what the rest of Dominion, even just a few miles away, was paying. which goes to show that what that means basically is that the power, especially the cheap power coming from, say, a power plant, a few hundred miles away, can't get to these local data centers. This led to a couple important things happening. Mostly that Dominion actually paused additions of some new data centers to the system. So they paused allowing these newly building data centers to interconnect to the grid, which I think was probably a first or a big deal if you're trying to get these things off the ground. So they did that until they could actually install the transmission grid upgrades necessary. Now we have seen essentially that's been pretty successful. For 2022, as I was saying, we've seen some big spikes, upwards of $200 a megawatt hour for a month average price. So those in the power world will know that's a pretty high level. Again, double what we saw. Since 2023, we've really seen that come back down. So very little congestion left in Dominion, or at least around Loudoun County, which basically goes to show that Dominion's been doing a pretty good job of connecting these data centers. Although I will note, there's still been some. It's not that there's no congestion left. There's been more than there was before, about 2021. And so, Julia, you were mentioning essentially sort of how things might look going forward. And I think Dominion it takes its role very seriously of allowing as much power, essentially allowing all these data centers to connect. We may start to see that stroll out. I think there's been a lot of transmission projects going on and grid upgrade projects going on both in Loudoun County and around the entire basically Northern Virginia, Maryland, and Southern Pennsylvania area, to basically mostly to get power to these data centers. And if these grid projects actually are completed on time and the way they're planned to be, that might all work out. I think the one risk is just that transmission, as we might know, transmission projects can often be bogged down, delayed. They're notoriously difficult to get done.
And Zach, you said it was kind of a big deal. I would say it was absolutely a big deal.
Yeah.
I remember that July day, I was on my boat in the Delaware Bay, and my phone started ringing, and it doesn't normally ring when I'm out. And people started saying, I just got a call from Dominion. And then another person, I just got a call from Dominion. Up to that point, we'd always just assumed power, right? I mean, it was just something that was, and maybe that was my mistake, maybe that was our mistake, that it was always just a given because it had always been a given. But that was a big deal when they started saying, hey, we need to push pause on this to try to figure out where we really are on with all the things that are coming. At that point, we had billions of dollars of investment that was stranded, not knowing whether or not they were going to be able to get power in any kind of significant timeline. So that was a big deal.
And in many ways, you're both highlighting it as a learning moment, a moment where things maybe went as they shouldn't have. But I would also highlight it as really strengthening or showing, I guess, the strength of that collaboration, Buddy, that you were talking about between the data centers, between you on the Loudoun side, and then between Dominion, that everybody was able to come to the table that quickly. So I'm sure that's one of the things that you highlight when you're having those conversations with other geographies about being absolutely critical.
Yeah, I think that we had to have that, right? I mean, because, and I would say that maybe we weren't as transparent as we needed to be. And, maybe the data center industry wasn't as transparent with the energy providers or the grid operators, or maybe their relationship wasn't as strong, or, whatever that was. Maybe the state wasn't as in tune with what these situations were. I mean, I always tell the story, we would see basically what the demand was going to be from a square footage standpoint. And that's how we measure. And then we would try to translate that into how many megawatts that would be. And we would give that to Dominion, and Dominion would look at that and they would say, wow, we've never seen growth like that. And then they would take that to PJM, and PJM would say, wow, we've never seen growth like that. And so, making sure that you're understanding what that is, and then you start to layer in, the chips taking more power, or all those factors that have come into play. It really is something that if you're not communicating and if you're not working together, it can really become a bottleneck.
Yeah, you both touched on two really big points that I want to come back to. So first, Zach, you talked about that nodal pricing in the United States that we see across the country. Certainly, that's a system that is still somewhat unique globally, right? That you get a local price signal that really gives you a sense on the ground for how strong the congestion is. But we're really having more conversations globally now with our clients and with our colleagues here at Aurora about A, implementing systems like that worldwide, but B, even the extent to which you don't see those type of congestion events signaled in power prices. I mean, those congestion events are still there, right? So that the system operator is needing to get ahead of it. And here, Buddy, like you're saying, we're kind of bringing everybody to the table around that conversation because folks are seeing it really reflected day to day. The other big point, Buddy, that you were just making there is about the forecasting, right? So you're thinking about the consumption or the data center locations in terms of square footage and then trying to translate that to power demand. So I might get to Zach first and then back to Buddy after that, which is thinking about this concept of forecasting power demand, because we're following PJM's forecasts pretty closely, and we see the new publication come out every year and kind of take a step back and gasp at how much they've increased that forecast. So Zach, can you help us understand, how does PJM create that forecast, right? Are they coming up with that on their own? And what do their latest forecasts look like? And as I said, then I'll pass it back to Buddy.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see that development. I mean, so to answer your first question, Julia, it's not just PJM sitting in a room and coming up with these numbers. From what I understand, there's a lot of input from the different basically utilities or the different zone operators, transmission operators around. So basically Dominion is there telling PJM, we see this much data center load coming up in the next 10 years. Or even within Dominion, some other utilities, for example, I think it's in Northern Virginia, Novec, also sort of passing on some more data center load growth assumptions. And PJM basically incorporating that, building it bottom up. And so basically what you can start to see from that is some pretty wild swinging in forecasts PJM publishes year on year. Now, these forecasts are really important, actually, because PJM bases a lot of the parameters for some of their markets on them, primarily how much capacity PJM has to get built, how much generation capacity to serve the load that it sees happening. You can't build a generator in a day. It takes several years, especially in a place like PJM. And so what we've really seen is basically, I mean, for context, over the past 15 years, at least, it's been actually kind of a slightly downward sloping trend in load in PJM. That's mostly due to energy efficiency, actually. There are more people slightly, but it's just, houses, electricity all require a little less. Now, suddenly PJM, even just 2 years ago, was predicting, a little mild growth, not much in electricity use over the next 15 years, maybe adding, 5 or 6% by 2035. Now, all of a sudden, in January 2024, PJM says that's going to grow from maybe a 5% growth in 15 years to a 25+% growth. So humongous increase in the amount of load that's going to be. Now, PJM has a pretty poor track record of actually getting its load forecast right. It's fun to actually just put all these lines on a graph and see them sort of shift back year over year, these upward sloping lines. But now, actually, I think there's a lot more consensus in the market that this is actually the right line. And this is the right forecast. This is about a 2.2% CAGR, so compound annual growth, so very, very large growth. And almost all of that, at least for the next 5 or 10 years, is from data centers. And most of those are in Northern Virginia.
Those are just incredible numbers that you're listing there, Zach. So, Buddy, what is that coming from? Is that from additional square footage that is contracted on the ground right now? Is that, we talk a lot about the efficiency of data centers, for example, right? Are we seeing those numbers go up and or down? Give us a little bit of context on that on the ground.
Yeah, well, first of all, forecasting is hard. And I agree that, historically, they haven't done a great job of forecasting. And, and I think that there would be those that would argue they went from being too conservative to maybe, too aggressive. But I think better to be aggressive. I think that, when we've seen historically how quickly this is growing, I think there's a combination of things. I think, first of all, yes, there is a growth of square footage like we've never seen. we started really 2007, 2008 to really build this. And by 2016, we became the largest data center market in the world. And then the growth started. You had the arrival of cloud, and then you had, COVID, and now you have AI. I mean, the growth over the last, 4 or 5 years has been incrementally or, exponentially bigger than the growth before that. We're at about 33.5 million square feet of operating data center right now with, really another 8 million that's approved and is being built. And there's probably another 8 million beyond that. And that's without, the board taking any more steps to approve any more land. We're probably just about done at about 52 million, because I think, obviously we've been doing this for a long time now, so we're a mature market, so there's not the same amount of growth. But when you're starting to project that, you're starting to see these density per rack numbers go up incredibly high. So I think every time you start to see more and more efficiency, you're starting to see more and more compute, right? And so we do our forecasts, and I will tell you that today I'm less confident in my forecast than any time during my 18 years here. Just because there are so many unknowns in our forecast that we just don't know how to really look at it anymore. So, but yeah, there's the density, but there's also the growth, that the demand is just so high for space right now.
Yeah. It really, I think, important to highlight, but I liked your contextualizing for us there, that the amount of uncertainty has just grown, if anything, even though we're a little bit more mature along the time frame there. And we started having this conversation, right, between our PJM team in Aurora and you, when we were trying to forecast some of this. And I think we just saw, Zach, please jump in and add anything or correct me here. But we just flexed a couple of those different scenarios, right? We said, hey, what happens if you have lower floor space than in the original forecast, and maybe lower power density? And then on the flip side of that, and you can easily get to double, triple the original forecast, right, if you flex some of those scenarios or variables down versus up. So just the amount of uncertainty is huge. And from a planning perspective, Buddy, I imagine if that makes your life, that can make your life quite complex. Excellent. Zach, what do you think? What's the Aurora in-house perspective right now on how spot on PJM's latest forecast is?
I mean, I think the general view is, I think we think PJM is overshooting it a bit. I mean, I will absolutely agree with Buddy. I think the uncertainty is huge, and that's, I think, point 2 of our in-house view. So point 1, PJM is probably overdoing it, but it could go so many directions. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty. Essentially, there's multiple dimensions of that uncertainty, that I could get into. I think, so Buddy, you underscore basically how much power are these, are we going to use per square foot, as well as maybe how many square feet are actually going to grow. I don't think anyone's actually questioning whether whether there's a global demand for new data centers. But I think some key questions that go with that, I might break this down to the sort of 3 dimensions. And that first one, that's sort of a given. But I think a really key one here is how much of that is actually going to come into Northern Virginia versus elsewhere. And certainly there's a lot of momentum right now in Northern Virginia, and I think that's going to continue for a few years. But because power is such an important cost component for data centers, or even just a question of whether they can be built on time, if there's actually grid connection issues, we might just see a shift towards other areas in the U.S. or other areas globally where power is cheaper or more available. I think we're starting to see Texas becoming an interesting area, as well as some of the Northwest coast, where there's a lot of hydropower, et cetera. And finally, as Buddy mentioned, there's just that uncertainty of how much electricity is going to be used by the data centers. But that can mean a lot of things, right? There's first just how much electricity our chips going to use. They're getting more efficient, but they're also packing more and more sort of power, computing power into a single chip. But there's also basically the option to not even get your power from the grid. Like, it's a longer term discussion, but one that's really I think up and coming right now in the data center world is basically, can you just bypass needing power from the electricity grid at all and generate it on site? So we're seeing some of that already with, say, on-site solar panels. But it's not impossible to imagine having an on-site natural gas generator. People are talking about on-site nuclear. There's actually some examples of that already. It all basically adding to this multidimensional uncertainty.
Can I layer on a couple more layers on top of your layers? There's some political uncertainty that's part of this now discussion, right? I mean, we in Loudoun County have been very supportive of data centers for a very long time, but now there's some political pushback on that here, and that's not unique to Loudoun. I mean, we're seeing this globally. You know, there's a ton of pushback. So I agree with you, Zach. We know there's the demand. We've got to figure out how to meet the demand. You know, my personal research would tell me that even at today's incredible build rate, that we're not going to have enough supply to meet demand for another decade. So we know that that's out there, but we get to where do we build it? Then we start to think about the power restrictions. And I agree with you. I think that this is a great opportunity for secondary and tertiary markets where you used to, you know, when you were going through your matrix, you know, you would have a lot of things and power would be, you know, in your top 5. Right now, companies are chasing power first. You know, you show me a location with power, then we can figure out the rest. So that, I think you're right. I think that that's going to be something. And I think the industry is going to try to control their own destiny by figuring out how to control their own destiny through their own power generation. We have already one company here that is doing gas generation on site. When I first started doing this, nobody wanted to be anywhere near gas generation or gas lines. Now they pay a premium to be near a gas line. So, you know, that is changing. You know, solar's tough because you need 15, 25 acres of solar to get 1 megawatt of power. So you think about the investment inherent in trying to come up with a lot of that, you know, that's tough. But then you have, you know, the battery technology to store that. So, you know, there's a ton of complexity in trying to forecast where, how much, and when right now.
Exactly, Buddy. And I think just to bring that back, all those reasons feed into why our in-house view comes in at lower than PJM's. I think there's just more things pushing that local North Virginia demand in the future down than up. That's not to say global demand or US-wide demand.
We've touched on so many big things here, and I really want to chase all of these threads because I think all of them are really important. First, to get us to this topic of how we even got to behind the meter generation, right? Because this is a relatively new conversation. I think we have to tie it back to our original point that this demand can really spike power prices, right? You have to kind of take a look at the utility scale system and understand the extent to which it's circular, right? You're increasing demand, and so you can increase power prices. And then the fact that those power prices are increasing, it's making it less attractive to build in that particular region, assuming you're relying on the grid scale power. So before I move on from there, Zach, anything that you want to add from the Aurora analysis? I know we tested the extent how increased demand really has an impact on power prices and why that starts to really shoot up and increase prices stepwise. And then I want to get back to some of these other topics we touched on.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what's interesting is also just how nonlinear we found the impact to be. So to kind of give a ballpark idea, in some of our testing, when we doubled basically our forecasted data center growth in Northern Virginia, that made power prices rise. That rose power prices in the area by about 7 to 8% compared to our base case. Now, when we tripled them instead of doubled them, that got to let's say about 30% increase. So you see that really huge nonlinearity, which I think goes to show there's something of almost like a natural upper boundary to how much load you can add to the grid before it really starts reacting, as it were, and basically causing pain for household power bills.
Right. And I think, Buddy, we had talked about that a little bit, right? How does Dominion face that question and come back and answer the question that they might be impacting power prices for Virginia as a whole or for Loudoun citizens?
Yeah, and believe me, that's the question that gets asked a lot. I mean, and I'm not sure that there's a clear answer yet. I mean, the one thing we know, right, is the grid is in no better shape than the road network of the United States, the bridges, the water. I mean, the power grid is just, it's not equipped to handle the load that's out there right now. And that means money. That means a significant amount of investment in this. I mean, you just look at the infrastructure that's going into Loudoun County, the southern line that'll be completed by the end of 25, early 26, but then the northern line in 27, and then tying it together, the north-south line will have the full loop by 28. And then, another line coming in from the west somewhere. I mean, think about the billions of dollars that's going to be involved in that. And then who's going to pay for that? And how does that trickle down to the citizens? That's a big, big question. And then what does that do to the renewable goals, the sustainability goals that the companies and we all have? I mean, it's a really complex equation that I don't really have an answer for yet.
Yeah, I think to give some context there, buddy, because you're absolutely right. These are monstrous sums basically that we're talking about when it's really grid level investment. PJM recently approved, I think it was upwards of $5 billion transmission package for that entire area, so Northern Virginia, Maryland, and Southern Pennsylvania, with the primary goal basically of getting power to these data centers. And that's related. There's a lot of difficulties wrapped up in that. Obviously, it's not just data center load growth, but we've got some older power plants in the area that we're helping that are retiring too, especially old coal and oil power plants. And so there too, you have to add more transmission grid to be able to get power from elsewhere, from further away. And this is just one example, right? $5 billion for a very small area of PJM's massive footprint.
And then the big elephant in the room, we've danced around it a couple times, are these decarbonization objectives. Virginia is fairly ambitious in terms of their decarbonization objectives. They have a system of renewables portfolio standards in place. And certainly tech companies, I think, are known globally as being fairly ambitious in their decarbonization targets. Buddy, how much does that still matter? I mean, has that been pushed lower on the list? You just mentioned that the topic of gas has come up now for the first time in a long time.
Yeah, no, I think that, you start to look at degrees, right? I mean, gas is not diesel, so that's probably good, but gas is not necessarily at the top of the list either. So, but I do think that we're looking at solutions like, green hydrogen. I've been a believer in green hydrogen, and, maybe either on its own or as part of the mix for gas, or, I don't know how we get to where we need to go without nuclear. I just don't. But, I don't know how we can get all these things together in a short period. But I think if you look out a decade or more, solutions are on the way. I'm encouraged by a lot of the things I'm seeing, but I think that there's still more pain before we can get to any real solutions.
Yeah, and for folks listening in, right, one of the really important conversations that we have and that it's important to contextualize here is the shape of that demand, right? So data center demand is pretty around the clock, right? It requires generation at all times. And so, Buddy, as you mentioned, there's a good amount of behind the meter solar that the data centers are bringing online. But the question becomes what happens in the other hours. So I think there's a good bit of optimism on tech companies starting to become energy companies as well, right? Investing in some of these really innovative solutions that are really ripe, I think, for additional investment and additional exploration. So who knows? Maybe Loudoun County will be really the future of seeing new technologies on the ground.
Well, I mean, really, that's a goal of ours. We not only think that we have the opportunity, but we think we have the responsibility. We think that because of the scale we have, that we have the opportunity to take a leadership role in trying to figure this out. And we're looking hard at what are those opportunities and how do we incentivize that kind of behavior. And the industry, I think, is they're not there yet, but I mean, at what point do we not need to have one-to-one backup for everything? Right now we have diesel generation backup for every, kilowatt that we have. Is that really necessary? Now, I understand that, it can be really frustrating if your Netflix buffers and because there's an outage or something, but is that really mission critical? I just think it's a conversation that we have to have. And at what point can we share some of this, backup and try to figure out a better way of providing this power?
Well, I think that load, that demand shape you talked about, Julie, is actually a very important point because it speaks to the ways you can approach this challenge, right? So on the one hand, you could say, well, data centers have a very flat, they basically consume power almost all the time without much variation. I think part of that is potentially due to sort of that large demand for data center capacity relative to the supply. So you can either try to figure out how to supply power when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. You can also think about how do you turn down your electricity use in those moments. And that might be the kind of thing you may see more in the future when there is perhaps more spare data center buffer, where you could even move your calculations to where the sun's shining most or the wind's blowing most. Whichever works best, really just comes down to cost in the end of the day. Is it cheaper to build a battery or some kind of carbon-free free electricity, or is it cheaper to build spare data center capacity?
Yeah, and I'm glad we've touched on a couple of these different technologies because batteries certainly are a hot topic that we talk about a lot in the United States, I think across global energy markets. But as we're discussing, when the demand pattern is that flat, I think you have to get more creative than that even and see how you provide some of that baseload. Or Zach, like you're saying, get flexible and creative on the locations of where that data center demand is being served from, even in the same couple of hours. Excellent, both of you. We've covered a lot of really interesting ground today. Let me wrap it up with a rapid fire question for both of you. Maybe Buddy first, and then Zach. What's the outlook? Is Virginia going to be the global or the U.S. hotspot for data centers in the next 5-10 years? And what's your perspective on how much of that we can meet with green power over the next couple of years?
Well, I would say that we will probably continue to see Virginia being one of the most important data center markets for all the reasons that's been so important. I think the growth rate inevitably will slow, and you're going to see a wider distribution of data centers throughout the country, throughout the world. And I think that's inevitable, and I think that's good. I don't know that we'll ever see a market that has the concentration that we have here. And I think that's okay. I think that the industry and government and utilities are all committed to the sustainability plan. I think that right now, only thing holding us back is physics. I mean, the technology just doesn't exist yet. I think there's plenty of will, and I think there's plenty of money to be thrown at it. It's just the technologies aren't there yet. And so I do think we can reach the sustainability goals. I mean, I don't think it's 2030 or 2035, but I think we're making incremental gains, and I think we're going to get there. And so I am optimistic. And I do think that I think we have a good chance to make a huge difference in this. And I have a lot of confidence that the big minds that are out there are heading in the right direction.
It's a great message of realism, but at the same time, optimism. Thanks, Buddy. Zach, anything to add there?
I think I agree with Buddy. I think in 10 years' time, Northern Virginia is going to still be in absolute terms, the global hotspot for data centers. But in terms of growth, it won't be anymore. I think we'll see other places start to be the more exciting areas for new data center load addition. I think the thing I'll add on the renewable or the decarbonization front is, it'll be a mix more likely than not, but I think the big technology that will really start coming to the stage in 10 years' time is nuclear. Still not sure, but I think that's really starting to come to the fore as a really likely and in some ways unavoidable piece of the puzzle towards decarbonizing, especially things like data centers.
I don't see how we get there without it. I really don't.
Yeah, really, really great stuff. And Zach, those global hotspots of growth that you mentioned, I'm sure they'll all be on the phone pretty frequently with Buddy, getting some of his best practices and those learned. Excellent. Well, thank you both so much. I think that's a good place to wrap up, but I really enjoyed the conversation today, and I've learned a lot. So hopefully our listeners have as well. Thanks so much for joining us, Zach.
Thanks so much, Julia.
And thanks, Buddy, for joining us.
It was a real pleasure. I love what you guys do, and always happy to be part of what Aurora's working on.
That was Julia Hoos, head of USA East at Aurora, talking to Buddy Rizer, Executive Director for the Department of Economic Development for Loudoun County, Virginia, and Zach Edelen, who leads Aurora's coverage of PJM. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth coverage with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.